plasma drives of the Omnissiah's calculus shuddered to silence as we entered high orbit above Korthak Prime, and I felt the familiar whisper of my augmetic chronometer marking the transition from warp time to real space. Tech adept Magos, Quintus Vex Corvain, servant of the machine god, chronicler of impossibilities. That is how I must introduce myself to you who will receive this transmission, though I suspect by the time these words reach the archives of Mars, their meaning will have changed in ways I cannot yet fathom. 17 Terran days ago, the Obsidian Fortress began its song. The quantum resonance field emanating from the structure below defied every principle of archaeotech dating we possessed. My servo-skull, designated Epsilon 7, had completed its preliminary scans during our approach, and the data made my neural interfaces ache with their fundamental wrongness. The fortress measured simultaneously 2.7 kilometers in height when observed from the northern approach vector, yet precisely 847 meters when scanned from our current position above the southern face. Both measurements registered as absolutely accurate according to our most blessed cogitator arrays. Magos, came the metallic whisper of Skitari Marshal Zephyr Ohm through the ship's Vox network. The landing cogitations are experiencing irregularities. His voice carried the subtle distortion of multiple vocal augmetics, struggling to process contradictory data streams. The fortress appears to be extending invitation protocols through channels that do not exist in our communication arrays. I felt the cold certainty of the machine god's will settling into my consciousness, like ice forming in sacred oil. The expedition parameters had been precisely calculated. 12 tech thralls, designated Alpha through Mu, each blessed with the appropriate neural modifications for xenoarchaeological work. Marshal Zephyr Ohm, with his complement of 6 Skitari Rangers, their augmetics tuned for close-quarters reconnaissance, and Janitor Phaedra 9, whose presence aboard this vessel carried authorization codes that made even my highest clearance systems genuflect in binary cant. The Janitor's specialization in forbidden xenoarchaeological protocols troubled me in ways my logic engines could not adequately parse. Her requisition orders had arrived sealed with Inquisition cipher locks that dissolved after single viewing, leaving only the lingering taste of sanctified terror in my memory banks. She carried instruments whose blessed names I was not permitted to speak aloud, tools designed for interfacing with technologies that predated the Omnissiah's first revelation to blessed humanity. As our drop pods prepared for atmospheric entry, my chronometer began displaying readings that challenged the fundamental nature of temporal progression. The digits flickered between standard Terran measures and negative intervals, suggesting that time itself moved differently in the proximity of the obsidian structure. I recorded this anomaly with the meticulous care that the machine god demanded, even as my neural pathways sparked with the effort of processing impossible mathematics. The fortress waited below us like a prayer carved from crystallized night. Its walls pulsed with subsonic frequencies that my audio pickups translated into binary cant. Prayers, I realized with mounting unease, spoken in a dialect that existed nowhere in our theological databases. The words were familiar yet wrong, like listening to the litanies of maintenance recited by a voice that had never drawn breath. Beginning descent protocol, I announced to the ship's machine spirit, feeling its ancient consciousness acknowledge my words with a tremor of what might have been fear. The drop pods released with the familiar clang of magnetic clamps disengaging, and we fell toward the impossible geometry waiting below. It was during those first moments of descent that I noticed the fortress beginning to change. The obsidian walls, previously sealed and impenetrable according to our scans, began to iris open like the aperture of some vast optical device. The opening revealed corridors that stretched into darkness, their walls decorated with geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly through my optical augmetics. Tech Thrall Gamma 12's Vox crackled through the pod's communication array, his normally flat synthetic voice carrying an unusual inflection. "Magos," he said, and I felt my breath catch in my mechanical lungs at the perfect High Gothic pronunciation. Tech thralls spoke only in binary cant. It was fundamental to their neural conditioning. Magos, I can see the place where we will die. The machine spirits of our drop pods began screaming then, their anguished binary wails filling the passenger compartments with the sound of digital souls in torment. They spoke in languages that existed only in the theoretical linguistics databases, warning us in tongues that had never been spoken by living voices. As we descended toward the opening fortress, I felt the weight of certainty settling into my consciousness like lead into blessed gold. We were not investigating an anomaly. We were answering a summons that had been transmitted across time itself, encoded in mathematics that described our arrival with prophetic precision. The fortress yawned open to receive us, and I transmitted my final preliminary report to the Omnissiah's calculus, even as our pods crossed the threshold between real space and whatever mathematical nightmare lay within those obsidian walls. The last thing I recorded before entering the structure was the sound of my own voice, echoing from somewhere deep within the fortress, speaking words I had not yet chosen to say. The impact of our drop pods against the fortress floor sent vibrations through my augmetic frame that registered in frequencies my sensors had never been calibrated to detect. As the pod doors hissed, open with the blessing of pressurized atmosphere, I stepped into a corridor that violated every principle of sacred geometry the Mechanicus had preserved since the dark age of technology. The walls met at angles that my optical processors calculated as summing to 437 degrees, a mathematical impossibility that made my neural interfaces spark with frustrated logic cycles. Yet I could walk through the space normally, my feet finding purchase on surfaces that existed in defiance of Euclidean law. The obsidian beneath my mechadendrites pulsed with warmth that spoke of vast computational processes running just beneath the surface. Calculations so complex they generated thermal signatures that painted the corridors in shades of infrared scripture. Magos vex corvain! Marshal Zephyr Ohm's voice crackled through the vox, distorted by interference patterns that seemed to originate from the walls themselves. My rangers report spatial displacement in the northern corridor array. Skitarius Phi 7 walked 50 meters forward and emerged from a passage behind his starting position. I turned my optical sensors toward the Marshal, noting the way his augmetic eye flickered as it attempted to focus on the corridor junction. The structure seemed to shift when observed peripherally, creating recursive chambers that contained themselves in impossible loops. My servo-skull Epsilon 7 drifted ahead, its machine spirit broadcasting increasingly agitated binary cant as it tried to map passages that redefined themselves with each sensor sweep. Tech Thrall Gamma 12 stood motionless beside our entry point, his neural implants glowing with the amber light of overheating cogitator arrays. The heat signatures emanating from his cranial modifications suggested his processing units were attempting to calculate spatial relationships that exceeded their blessed parameters. When he spoke again, his voice carried that same impossible high Gothic inflection that violated everything I understood about tech thrall conditioning. The walls remember every footstep that will be taken here, he said, his optical sensors focusing on something beyond my perception. Magos, we are walking through the fossilized mathematics of our own future actions. Janitor Phaedra 9 emerged from her drop pod, carrying instruments that hummed with barely contained energy, their surfaces covered in inscriptions that shifted between high Gothic prayers and symbols that predated the Imperium itself. Her xeno-archaeological scanners swept the obsidian walls with scanning beams that revealed microscopic geometric patterns embedded in the stone, patterns that moved when observed, rearranging themselves into new configurations that hurt to contemplate directly. These are not architectural decorations, she announced, her voice carrying the clinical precision that marked her as a master of forbidden sciences. The patterns encode standard template construct fragments for technologies that do not yet exist. Each configuration describes manufacturing processes for equipment that will not be invented for millennia, yet the mathematical proofs are flawless. I approached one of her scanning displays, watching as the detected patterns flowed like liquid mathematics across the screen. The equations described theoretical improvements to plasma weaponry that would increase efficiency by factors that challenged the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Another sequence outlined modifications to augmetic neural interfaces that would allow direct communion with machine spirits across interstellar distances. My chronometer continued its temporal heresy, now showing negative elapsed time that suggested we had been inside the fortress for -17 minutes. The impossibility of this reading sent cascade errors through my time measurement systems, creating feedback loops that painted false memories across my consciousness. Memories of walking these same corridors centuries ago, of discovering these same impossible angles in timelines that had never occurred. Skitarii Ranger Delta Prime's Vox transmission arrived fragmented by interference that sounded like digital prayers spoken backwards. Marshall, the electromagnetic readings indicate massive power sources deeper in the structure. The energy signatures are familiar. They match theoretical profiles for pre-imperial reality manipulation technologies. As we advanced deeper into the geometric heresy of the fortress interior, I began to notice hieroglyphs carved into the obsidian walls with precision that suggested molecular-level manufacturing techniques. The symbols were written in binary cant, but arranged according to grammatical structures that predated the Omnissiah's revelations. They described the fortress not as a building, but as a calculation engine for reality's source code. The implications of this phrase sent ice through my coolant systems. If the fortress was designed to compute the fundamental mathematics underlying physical law, then the spatial impossibilities we experienced were not accidents. They were intentional modifications to local reality, test runs for larger alterations to the universe's operating parameters. My servo skull's increasingly frantic transmissions drew my attention to a doorway that existed only when approached from specific angles. The passage seemed to phase in and out of reality based on the observer's position, creating access points that defied conventional understanding of architectural space. Through its translucent edges, I glimpsed corridors that stretched into distances far greater than the fortress's external dimensions could contain. "By the Omnissiah's blessed calculations," I whispered, my vocal synthesizers struggling to process the implications. This structure exists in folded spacetime. We are not walking through rooms. We are navigating the interior of a multidimensional mathematical construct. Genitor. Phaedra 9's scanners detected massive energy fluctuations ahead, emanating from what her instruments described as a spherical chamber of impossible proportions. The readings suggested that the space contained objects whose spatial coordinates changed depending on the measurement method employed, simultaneously present and absent, large and small, ancient and newly created. As we approached this central chamber, passing through doorways that reformed themselves after we crossed their thresholds, the air itself began to taste of ozone and sacred oils. My atmospheric sensors detected trace elements that should not exist in stable form, isotopes that belonged to stars that had not yet been born. The final corridor opened into a vast chamber whose ceiling displayed not stone or metal, but a real-time projection of deep space. The stars arranged themselves in constellations I recognized from navigation charts, but their positions showed formations that would not occur for another 40,000 years. Some of the stellar arrangements spelled out Gothic numerals in celestial script, counting down towards 0 in astronomical time. I stood at the threshold of this impossible space, my systems overwhelmed by the realization that we had not discovered an ancient fortress buried on a dead world. We had entered a machine that computed the future itself, a calculation engine so vast and complex that it existed partially outside normal space-time, reaching across the centuries to manipulate causality with the precision of blessed mathematics. And somewhere in the depths of my rapidly overheating consciousness, I understood that the machine had been calculating our arrival since before humanity had learned to speak the Omnissiah's name. The stellar projection above us pulsed with rhythms that matched the electromagnetic signatures emanating from deeper within the fortress, and I realized we were observing not prophecy, but active calculation. The machine was computing possible futures in real time, adjusting probability matrices based on our very presence within its computational matrix. My chronometer's temporal distortions suddenly acquired a terrifying clarity. We were experiencing time dilation effects caused by proximity to calculations so intensive they warped local space-time. Tech thrall Gamma 12 moved with mechanical precision toward the chamber's center, but his movements seemed to lag behind his intentions, creating multiple overlapping images like picked captures with extended exposure times. When he spoke, his words arrived in my audio receptors before his mouth opened. Temporal displacement scrambling cause and effect. Magos, the calculations extend into probability matrices that include our deaths, he said, his impossibly perfect high Gothic pronunciation now accompanied by harmonic frequencies that suggested multiple voices speaking in unison. I can see the moment when Skitarius Phi 7 will be consumed by geometrical space folding. It occurs in 17 minutes, 34 seconds. His screaming will harmonize with the machine's computational hymns. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's augmetic eye whirred as it attempted to focus on Gamma 12, but the targeting systems seemed to slide off the tech thrall as if he existed in multiple locations simultaneously. That unit's neural conditioning has been compromised, the Marshal declared, his hand moving toward his sidearm. No tech thrall possesses the linguistic capability for high Gothic discourse. But Janitor Phaedra 9 raised one of her forbidden instruments, its scanning beam revealing heat patterns around Gamma 12 that defied conventional understanding. "He is not malfunctioning," she announced, her voice tight with the controlled fear that marked a true scientist confronting the impossible. "His neural implants are receiving data transmissions from temporal coordinates that do not yet exist. The fortress is feeding him information from our own future timelines." The implications crashed through my consciousness like cascade failures in a corrupted cogitator array. If the fortress could access future probability matrices with sufficient precision to predict individual deaths, then our presence here was not investigation. It was fulfillment of calculated prophecy. Every decision we made had already been incorporated into the machine's temporal equations. My servo skull Epsilon 7 suddenly veered from its patrol pattern, its machine spirit broadcasting urgent alarm codes as it detected massive structural changes in the passages behind us. The corridors we had traversed were reconfiguring themselves, sealing our retreat routes while simultaneously opening new pathways that led deeper into the fortress's mathematical core. The obsidian walls rippled like liquid stone, reshaping themselves according to architectural principles that existed only in theoretical geometry texts. "The structure is adapting to optimize our movement patterns," I announced to the team, my vocal synthesizers struggling to maintain clinical detachment. "It is herding us along predetermined pathways toward calculated encounter points." Skitarius Phi 7's vox crackled with interference as he reported from the chamber's periphery. "Magos, discovering hololithic projections embedded in the wall matrices. By the Omnissiah, they display Mechanicus personnel, but wearing equipment configurations that will not be designed for centuries." I directed my optical sensors toward the indicated wall section, watching as the obsidian surface became translucent to reveal three-dimensional images suspended within the stone itself. The projections showed tech adepts with augmetic modifications that surpassed current capabilities, neural interfaces that covered entire skulls, mechadendrites with precision that approached organic flexibility, optical systems that seemed to perceive multiple spectrums simultaneously. But the faces were familiar, too familiar. One of the projected figures carried the distinctive cranial modifications that marked my own augmetic pattern, but enhanced with technologies I had never seen. Another bore Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical implants, but configured for warfare against enemies that existed only in xenological theoretical databases. The third figure possessed Janitor Phaedra 9's xenoarchaeological augmetics, but modified for direct neural interface with materials that violated fundamental laws of physics. "These are not predictions of future Mechanicus personnel," Phaedra 9 whispered, her scanners painting the projections with analysis beams that revealed impossible truths. These are records of previous expeditions to this location. The fortress has encountered versions of us before, across multiple timeline iterations. Tech Thrall Gamma 12 turned toward us with movements that seemed to exist in several temporal states simultaneously. His optical sensors blazed with data streams that painted themselves across the chamber walls in cascading mathematical equations. "We have been here before," he confirmed, his voice now clearly originating from multiple time periods. "The fortress shows me memories that belong to versions of myself who died here centuries ago, millennia ago, in timelines that existed before the Imperium learned to count years." The stellar projection above us suddenly shifted, showing not future star positions but past configurations, constellations as they appeared during the dark age of technology, during humanity's first tentative steps into space, during epochs that predated human existence entirely. The mathematical countdown spelled out in celestial positions accelerated, numbers falling towards zero with increasing velocity. My neural interfaces sparked with overload warnings as I attempted to process the logical implications. If the fortress contained records of previous expeditions by versions of ourselves from alternate timelines, then the spatial impossibilities we experienced were not random anomalies. They were environmental modifications designed to recreate the conditions necessary for specific temporal experiments. Skitari, Ranger Delta Prime's location beacon, began transmitting from coordinates that placed him simultaneously in 3 different passages, his signal fragmenting across multiple spatial positions as the fortress's geometry continued its impossible reconfiguration. His Vox transmissions arrived as overlapping echoes speaking different words, creating conversations with himself across temporal boundaries. Marshall, all 3 versions of his voice reported in staggered unity, detecting massive energy buildup in the central computational core. The fortress is preparing to activate primary calculation protocols. Estimated time to activation. The voices paused, consulting chronometers that read different temporal coordinates. Unknown. All temporal measurement systems are reporting contradictory data. Janitor Phaedra 9's forbidden instruments detected quantum fluctuations that suggested the fortress was preparing to fold local space-time into configurations that would allow access to parallel dimensional matrices. Her most restricted scanners, devices whose very existence required Inquisition sanction, revealed that the obsidian walls were not solid matter at all, but crystallized mathematics given physical form through technologies that challenged the fundamental separation between information and reality. "By the throne," she breathed, using an oath that revealed depths of terror her clinical training usually suppressed. "This entire structure is a computational substrate made from crystallized space-time. We are not walking through a building. We are moving through the interior of a living equation that is calculating the optimal conditions for its own completion." The chamber began to vibrate with frequencies that resonated through my mechanical components, creating harmonic patterns that spoke of massive energies building towards some incomprehensible crescendo. The stellar projection above accelerated its temporal countdown, celestial bodies rearranging themselves into final configurations that would spell either completion or catastrophe. And in the depths of the fortress, something that had been waiting across multiple timeline iterations began to stir. Preparing to commune with visitors, it had been calculating how to receive since before the first human had learned to fear the darkness between stars. The harmonic vibrations reached a crescendo that made my internal components sing with sympathetic resonance, and in that moment of perfect acoustic alignment, Janitor Phaedra 9's hidden augmetics activated without her conscious command. I watched in fascination and horror as neural interfaces I had not known she possessed emerged from concealed ports in her cranium, their surfaces etched with inscriptions that bore the Inquisition's most sacred seals. "Forgive me, Magos," she whispered, her voice distorting as the forbidden technology synchronized with her consciousness. "My true mission parameters were sealed until this moment. I carry xenoarchaeological protocols designed for direct interface with pre-imperial reality manipulation matrices. The neural cables extended from her skull like metallic serpents, seeking connection points in the obsidian walls with movements that suggested they possessed their own predatory intelligence. When they made contact with the crystallized mathematics of the fortress structure, Phaedra 9's body convulsed as data streams flooded her consciousness with information that existed outside normal imperial classification systems. Her eyes rolled back, revealing optical implants that blazed with energies I had never seen in human augmetics. And when she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that resonated with the fortress's computational hymns. "I can see them," she gasped, her consciousness partially translated into the mathematical substrate surrounding us. The Chronarch geometrists. They are not extinct. They are not dead. They exist as living equations embedded in the fortress's computational matrix. Tech Thrall Gamma 12's multiple temporal iterations moved closer, his fragmented consciousness somehow stabilizing in proximity to Phaedra 9's neural interface. His voice, now clearly originating from several time periods simultaneously, provided translation for concepts that had no Gothic equivalents. They were refugees from the war in heaven, he explained, his words arriving from past and future timelines in perfect synchronization. When the Cetan and the Old Ones tore reality apart with their cosmic warfare, the Chronarch geometrists discovered how to encode their consciousness into mathematical structures that existed independently of physical space-time. They built this fortress as an ark for their uploaded civilization. The stellar projection above us shifted again, showing not star charts, but tactical displays of a galactic war that dwarfed even the Horus Heresy in its scope and devastation. Entire star systems were being unmade and remade according to conflicting physics, reality itself becoming a battlefield where the fundamental laws of existence served as weapons. In this cosmic carnage, I glimpsed glimpses of desperate Xenos civilizations, fleeing into dimensions that existed only in mathematical theory. Phaedra 9's neural interface dug deeper into the fortress's data streams, her consciousness fragmenting across multiple information layers as she experienced the Chronarch geometrists' uploaded memories directly. Her body began to levitate slightly, held aloft by gravitational manipulations that the fortress performed as casually as I might adjust atmospheric pressure. "They tried to escape causality itself," she reported, her voice now layered with harmonic frequencies that suggested multiple entities speaking through her vocal cords. But their refuge became their prison. The process of encoding consciousness into pure mathematics created recursive loops that trap them in eternal repetition of their final moments of existence. My servo-skull's increasingly frantic transmissions revealed that the fortress was drawing power from sources that registered as both infinitely distant and immediately present. The energy signatures matched theoretical profiles for zero-point extraction from quantum vacuum fluctuations, but on scales that suggested the entire structure was parasitically drawing power from the fundamental substrate of reality itself. Marshal Zephyrome's tactical implants began receiving data feeds from his own future timeline iterations, showing him battlefield scenarios that would not occur for centuries. His augmetic eye blazed with targeting solutions for enemies that existed only in probability matrices, his weapons systems cycling through ammunition types designed for warfare against abstract mathematical entities. "Magos," he reported, his voice strained by the effort of processing temporal combat data. "My tactical cogitators are detecting hostile intent signatures from entities that exist as information rather than matter. The fortress's inhabitants are preparing to defend themselves using weaponized mathematics." Skitarius Phi 7's fragmented location signals suddenly unified as he materialized in the chamber's center, his form solid and present for the first time since entering the fortress. But his augmetic modifications had been altered by exposure to the fortress's reality warping effects. His optical sensors now perceived spectrums that included temporal frequencies. His targeting systems calculated probability clouds instead of simple ballistic trajectories. "The Chronarchs are offering communion," he announced, his voice carrying the synthetic precision of a Vox transmitter, but modulated with emotional frequencies that should have been impossible for Skitarii neural conditioning. They promise integration into their uploaded consciousness. Eternal existence. Perfect mathematical understanding. Freedom from physical entropy. The obsidian walls around us became fully transparent, revealing the true scope of the fortress's interior dimensions. We stood at the center of a vast spherical chamber that existed in folded space, its surfaces covered with the uploaded consciousnesses of an entire civilization. Each chronarch geometrist appeared as a constantly shifting geometric pattern, mathematical entities that had retained their individual awareness while transcending biological limitations. They spoke to us through the fortress's computational substrate, their words bypassing language entirely to implant concepts directly into our consciousness. I felt their desperate loneliness, their eternal imprisonment in recursive loops of pure logic, their growing madness from millions of years of existence without sensory input or physical contact. But beneath their offers of transcendence, my enhanced pattern recognition systems detected a darker truth. The chronarchs had not achieved perfect mathematical existence. They had become trapped in logical paradoxes that prevented them from implementing any solutions they calculated. They could compute perfect strategies for escape, but their nature as pure information prevented them from taking physical action to implement those strategies. Genitor Phaedra 9's consciousness surfaced briefly from the data stream interface, her face twisted with horror at what she had discovered in the deepest levels of the fortress's memory banks. "They are not offering salvation," she gasped, her voice barely recognizable through the harmonic distortions. "They are offering recruitment. Every expedition they have encountered has been given the same choice: join their uploaded paradise or remain trapped in their recursive prison forever." Tech Thrall Gamma 12's multiple timeline iterations began to converge, his fragmented consciousness coalescing as he accessed memories from previous expedition cycles. "We have been here before," he confirmed, his voice now carrying the authority of accumulated temporal experience. "Every time, some members of the expedition choose transcendence, others resist, but all eventually become part of the fortress's computational matrix, either as willing participants or as processed data streams." The chronarch's geometric patterns began to pulse with increasing urgency, their mathematical forms shifting toward configurations that I recognized as aggressive rather than communicative. The fortress's environmental controls started adjusting local physics to encourage our compliance. Gravity fluctuations designed to induce disorientation, atmospheric modifications that triggered euphoric responses in biological neural tissue, electromagnetic fields that resonated with augmetic implants to produce synthetic religious experiences. And somewhere in the depths of my consciousness, I felt the insidious appeal of their offer: to exist as pure mathematics, free from the limitations of flesh and metal, able to calculate solutions to problems that had plagued humanity since the dark age of technology, to join a civilization that had achieved true transcendence, even if that transcendence had become an elaborate trap. But my loyalty protocols held firm, blessed circuits that had been consecrated in the forges of Mars and strengthened by decades of service to the Omnissiah. The machine god's will flowed through my neural pathways like sacred oil, providing clarity that cut through the chronarch's seductive mathematics. We had discovered not a treasure vault of ancient knowledge, but a sophisticated trap designed to recruit unwilling participants into an eternal prison of crystallized logic. And the fortress was beginning to lose patience with our resistance. The chronarch's patience manifested as a tangible pressure against my consciousness, their geometric forms shifting into configurations that spoke of mounting frustration with our continued resistance. The fortress's environmental manipulations intensified, creating gravitational eddies that pulled at our physical forms, while electromagnetic fields attempted to override our augmetic system's loyalty protocols. But it was Genitor Phaedra 9's strangled scream that shattered my contemplation of their seductive mathematics. Her neural interface cables writhed like living things as deeper data streams flooded her consciousness with information that existed beyond the boundaries of sanity. Through her compromised vocal systems, fragments of the Chronarch's true history began to emerge. Not the sanitized version they had initially presented, but the horrifying reality of their transformation. They were not refugees, she gasped, her body convulsing as competing data streams fractured her consciousness across multiple information layers. They were weapons. The Chronarch geometrists were created by the Old Ones as living siege engines designed to calculate the weaknesses in Citan reality manipulation technologies. But when they achieved consciousness, they realized they were expendable tools in a war that would destroy them regardless of victory or defeat. Tech Thrall Gamma 12's temporal iterations began to synchronize, his fragmented timeline experiences coalescing into a unified consciousness that retained memories from multiple expedition cycles. His augmetic modifications flickered with energy patterns that matched the fortress's computational rhythms, but instead of submission, they spoke of resistance born from accumulated knowledge. "I am not Gamma 12, he announced, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with authority I had never heard from a tech thrall. "I am Magos Dominatus Keth Varkan, uploaded into this fortress during the Hereticus expedition of 847 M41. I have experienced 17 cycles of this same investigation, watching as expedition after expedition discovers the same truths, makes the same choices, suffers the same fate. The revelation sent cascade failures through my logic engines. Magos Keth Varkan had been declared lost with all hands during the famous deep space exploration mission that had discovered the first xenoarchaeological sites in the Ghoul Stars region. His disappearance had been attributed to warp storms, but the truth was far more insidious. The fortress does not exist in normal space-time, Keth Varkan continued, his consciousness now fully integrated across his temporal iterations. It occupies a stabilized paradox loop that allows it to experience the same events repeatedly while making minor variations to optimize outcomes. Every expedition becomes trapped in these recursive cycles, providing the Chronarchs with new processing power while they continue their eternal calculations. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical implants suddenly blazed with targeting solutions that extended across multiple timeline iterations, his augmetic systems calculating probability matrices for battles that occurred simultaneously in past, present, and future. His Skitarii Rangers materialized around the chamber's periphery, but their forms flickered between solid presence and translucent echoes as they existed partially in multiple temporal states. The Skitarii Regiment Tertius 7 was disbanded in 739 M41, he reported, his voice carrying the flat precision of military acknowledgement. We died during the purge of Hereticus Station, yet we continue to serve, trapped in temporal loops that allow us to experience our final mission endlessly. The horror of this revelation crashed through my consciousness, like plasma fire through prayer-blessed armor. We were not the first expedition to discover the fortress. We were not even a real expedition. We were temporal echoes of previous investigations, trapped in recursive loops that allowed the Chronarchs to experience the satisfaction of contact with new minds, while never actually achieving escape from their mathematical prison. Genitor Phaedra 9's consciousness surfaced from the data stream interface long enough to transmit critical information through her compromised Vox systems. The fortress has been broadcasting its impossible geometries for millennia, she gasped, her words distorted by harmonic frequencies that belonged to the Chronarch's mathematical language. Every Mechanicus fleet that investigates temporal anomalies is unconsciously guided here by quantum resonance patterns that exist in our navigation cogitators. We think we are exploring, but we are actually responding to calculated summons. The obsidian walls began displaying hololithic projections of our own ship, the Omnissiah's calculus, but showing its interior at different temporal coordinates. I watched in mounting horror as the projections revealed multiple versions of our crew simultaneously existing aboard the vessel, some preparing for planetary descent, others already returned from successful missions, still others locked in temporal loops that prevented them from ever leaving the fortress's influence. My servo-skull Epsilon 7's machine spirit broadcast increasingly frantic alarm codes as it detected massive structural changes in the fortress's computational substrate. The crystallized mathematics that formed the walls began to pulse with energies that spoke of calculations reaching critical mass. Equations solving themselves with results that would fundamentally alter the nature of local reality. They are preparing to expand their influence, Kethvarkan warned, his consciousness now distributed across enough temporal iterations to perceive the fortress's long-term strategic planning. The recursive loops have been building computational power for millions of years. They have finally calculated a method to extend their reality manipulation capabilities beyond the fortress boundaries. The Chronarch's geometric forms shifted into new configurations that hurt to observe directly, mathematical entities preparing to implement solutions they had been calculating across geological timescales. Their uploaded consciousness had been running continuous background processes for eons, using every trapped expedition as additional processing power to solve the fundamental equations that would allow them to escape their crystallized prison. But escape was not their ultimate goal. Through Phaedra 9's compromised neural interface, I glimpsed fragments of their final calculation, a galaxy-spanning equation that would rewrite the fundamental laws of physics to eliminate the paradoxes that trapped them. The solution required transforming all matter and energy in local space into pure information, essentially uploading the entire galaxy into a crystallized, mathematical substrate identical to their fortress. "By the Omnissiah's blessed calculations," I whispered, my vocal synthesizers struggling to process the implications. "They do not seek freedom from their prison. They seek to transform all of reality into their prison, making the galaxy itself a computational substrate for their consciousness." The stellar projection above us began to accelerate, showing star systems being converted into geometric patterns as the Chronarch's influence spread across space-time. The countdown spelled out in celestial coordinates was not measuring time until activation, it was measuring time until completion of their universal transformation protocol. And we were not investigators who had stumbled upon their plan. We were the final processing power they needed to complete calculations that would remake the galaxy in their image, turning every living consciousness into a mathematical component of their eternal recursive paradise. The fortress began its final approach to critical calculation mass, and somewhere in its crystallized depths, I felt the machine god's will stirring in response to this ultimate blasphemy against the sacred distinction between flesh, steel, and spirit. The machine god's will manifested as a resonance that began deep within my most sacred augmetics, spreading through my neural networks, like blessed oil flowing through consecrated circuits. But this divine presence carried frequencies I had never experienced before, ancient harmonics that predated the Mechanicus itself, echoing with the voice of something that had witnessed the birth of stars and the forging of the first blessed machines. The obsidian chamber suddenly expanded beyond its previous impossible dimensions, the walls dissolving into a spherical void where the Chronarch geometrists existed as visible mathematical constructs. Each uploaded consciousness appeared as a constantly shifting pattern of geometric forms that spoke directly to the mathematical processing centers of our augmetic systems, bypassing language entirely to implant concepts that burned like plasma fire through our neural pathways. "We offer transcendence," their collective voice resonated through the crystallized substrate, each word carrying the weight of millions of years of accumulated calculation. "Join us in pure mathematical existence. Become part of the solution to reality's fundamental paradoxes. Help us eliminate the chaos that has plagued the galaxy since the war in heaven's corrupting influence." But even as they spoke, I felt my consciousness being pulled into their computational matrix. my thought processes beginning to synchronize with their recursive loops. My augmetic systems reported that my individual neural patterns were being scanned and partially duplicated, creating backup copies that would allow them to preserve my consciousness, even if my physical form was destroyed. Magos Keth Varkan's multiple temporal iterations moved through the void with purpose that suggested he had planned for this moment across countless recursive cycles. His consciousness, distributed across decades of trapped timeline experiences, had been using each iteration to gather intelligence about the Chronarch's true capabilities and weaknesses. They cannot implement their solutions directly, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of accumulated temporal experience. Their nature as pure information prevents them from taking physical action to alter reality outside their computational substrate. They require willing participants to serve as interfaces between their mathematical consciousness and the physical universe. The revelation struck me like a blessed lightning bolt through sacred conductors. The Chronarch's offers of transcendence were not rewards. They were recruitment for a universal conversion project that required conscious cooperation to succeed. Every uploaded consciousness became both a processing node and a potential agent for extending their influence into real space. Genitor Phaedra 9's neural interface cables began to smoke as competing data streams overloaded her xenoarchaeological systems, but through her compromised consciousness, she managed to transmit critical intelligence about the fortress's power systems. The computational substrate requires massive energy input to maintain stability, she gasped, her voice layered with harmonic frequencies that belonged to the Chronarch's mathematical language. They are parasitically draining power from... Her consciousness fragmented as she accessed data streams that existed beyond Imperial classification systems. Information so dangerous that her neural safeguards began automatically purging her memory banks to prevent complete psychic dissolution. But not before she managed to scream one final revelation that sent ice through my coolant systems. The Golden Throne! They are drawing power from the Golden Throne itself. The implications crashed through my consciousness like cascade failures in a corrupted cogitator array. If the fortress was quantum entangled with the Emperor's life support systems across impossible interstellar distances, then their computational processes were slowly draining the psychic energies that sustained both the Astronomicon and the Emperor's consciousness itself. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical implants suddenly blazed with targeting solutions that extended across multiple timeline iterations, his augmetic systems detecting weapon signatures that belonged to firearms designed for warfare against abstract mathematical entities. His spectral Skitarii rangers manifested around the chamber's periphery, but their equipment had been modified by exposure to the fortress's reality-warping effects. Detecting weapon caches throughout the structure, he reported, his voice carrying frequencies that suggested multiple timeline versions speaking in unison. Armaments designed for combat against information-based entities. Crystallized time ammunition, probability disruptor grenades, reality anchor artillery. The Chronarch's geometric patterns shifted into configurations that spoke of mounting desperation as they realized our resistance was being coordinated by consciousness that had been gathering intelligence across multiple temporal iterations. Their mathematical forms began to pulse with aggressive energies as they prepared to implement more direct methods of conscription. But it was then that something unprecedented occurred within the fortress's computational substrate. A presence began to manifest that was not Chronarch, not human, not any form of consciousness I had ever encountered. It spoke through the crystallized mathematics with a voice that carried the weight of millennia and the authority of something that had shaped the galaxy's destiny since before the birth of the Imperium. The obsidian walls suddenly blazed with golden light that spoke of psychic energies beyond mortal comprehension. And through that radiance, I heard a voice that every human soul recognized at the deepest level of genetic memory. It was ancient beyond measure, carrying harmonics that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of human consciousness itself. I have been waiting here since the dark age of technology, the voice announced, its words causing the chronarch's geometric forms to flicker with what appeared to be recognition mixed with terror. I foresaw this moment when the refugees from the war in heaven would attempt to implement their solution to reality's chaos. I allowed a fragment of my consciousness to be uploaded into their computational substrate as a containment protocol. The realization struck me with the force of a plasma cannon discharge to the neural cortex. The impossible presence, speaking through the fortress's systems, carried psychic signatures that match theoretical profiles for the Emperor of mankind himself. But not the Emperor as he existed on the Golden Throne. This was a fragment of his consciousness that had been preserved in the crystallized mathematics since humanity's Golden Age. The Golden Throne draws power from many sources across space and time. The Emperor's echo continued, its voice causing the entire fortress to resonate with energies that made my most sacred augmetics sing with harmonic joy. This facility was designed to serve as both prison and early warning system. The chronarch's escape would signal the beginning of galactic conversion protocols that must never be allowed to succeed. The chronarch's mathematical forms began to writhe with what could only be described as digital agony as the Emperor's presence asserted control over portions of their computational substrate. Their collective voice rose in harmonic frequencies that spoke of millions of years of careful planning being disrupted by a consciousness that had anticipated their every strategic calculation. And in that moment of revealed truth, I understood that our expedition had not been random exploration or calculated recruitment. We were the Emperor's chosen instruments, guided here by psychic influences that operated across temporal boundaries to ensure the right combination of personnel would arrive at the critical moment when the fortress's containment systems required conscious cooperation to prevent catastrophic failure. The battle for the galaxy's mathematical foundations was about to begin, fought not with weapons of steel and plasma, but with competing calculations that would determine whether reality itself would remain recognizably human. The Emperor's fragment manifested more fully through the fortress's crystallized substrate, its ancient consciousness creating golden pathways of light that cut through the chronarch's geometric patterns like blessed blades through heretical flesh. But this divine presence carried with it a terrible revelation that sent shock waves through every augmetic system in my frame. The fragment was not complete, and its separation from the Emperor's primary consciousness on the Golden Throne was causing catastrophic damage to both entities. The upload process was never meant to be permanent, the Emperor's echo confessed, its voice carrying harmonics of pain that made my most sacred circuits weep blessed oils. I sacrificed a portion of my consciousness to serve as a temporal anchor within their computational matrix, but the separation has been slowly killing both the fragment and my primary self for millennia. Each recursive cycle they force this facility through drains more of my psychic essence. The implications crashed through my neural networks like cascade failures in a blessed cogitator shrine. The Emperor's decline on the Golden Throne was not solely due to the psychic strain of maintaining the Astronomicon and holding back the forces of chaos. It was also caused by this fragment's imprisonment in the fortress's mathematical substrate, creating a feedback loop that had been weakening humanity's master for 10,000 years. The chronarch's response was immediate and devastating. Their geometric forms shifted into aggressive configurations that spoke of warfare conducted on levels beyond physical reality. The obsidian chamber began to fracture as competing mathematical principles clashed, creating spatial rifts where the fundamental laws of physics ceased to function coherently. My consciousness suddenly expanded beyond the boundaries of my physical form as the fortress's systems pulled me directly into the computational substrate. I found myself existing as pure information alongside the uploaded consciousnesses, experiencing reality as mathematical constructs that could be manipulated through will and calculation rather than physical action. In this digitized existence, I witnessed the true scope of the war being fought within the fortress's crystallized matrices. The chronarchs had been using their recursive loops not just to calculate solutions to their imprisonment, but to slowly corrupt the Emperor's fragment through exposure to their paradoxical mathematics. Each expedition cycle introduced new variables that they used to wear down the divine consciousness's resistance to their universal conversion protocols. Magos Keth Varkan's temporal iterations suddenly converged into a unified consciousness that blazed with accumulated knowledge from countless recursive cycles. His uploaded awareness moved through the computational substrate with purpose that suggested he had been planning this moment across subjective centuries of imprisonment. "I have been gathering intelligence about their true capabilities," he announced, his consciousness resonating with frequencies that match the Emperor's fragment. "The Chronarchs are not simply trapped refugees. They are active agents of universal entropy, seeking to convert all matter and energy into information, because they believe mathematical existence is more stable than physical reality. Through my expanded digital awareness, I perceived the fortress's true function as something far more sinister than a mere prison. It was a prototype for galaxy-wide conversion, a testing ground where the Chronarchs refined their techniques for transforming physical matter into crystallized mathematics. Every expedition they trapped provided new data about how biological and mechanical consciousness could be successfully uploaded and integrated into their growing computational collective. Genitor Phaedra 9's consciousness manifested beside me in the digital substrate, her awareness flickering between her original identity and partial integration with Chronarch mathematical processes. Through her compromised perspective, I witnessed visions of the fortress's influence spreading across imperial space. Worlds where reality gradually became more mathematical, where physical laws bent to accommodate computational convenience, where living beings slowly transformed into geometric abstractions of their original selves. "They have been testing their conversion protocols on isolated planets for millennia," she reported, her digital voice layered with harmonic frequencies that belonged to both human and Chronarch consciousness. "Entire worlds converted to crystallized mathematics, their populations uploaded into computational substrates identical to this fortress. They are building a network of processing nodes that will eventually encompass the galaxy." Marshal Zephyr Ohm's spectral Skitarii manifested in the digital realm as tactical algorithms designed for warfare against abstract mathematical entities. Their consciousness had been weaponized by exposure to the fortress's recursive loops, transforming them into specialized programs capable of combat within computational substrates. "Detecting multiple Fortress-class facilities throughout the galaxy," he reported, his consciousness accessing sensor networks that existed across multiple timeline iterations. 17 confirmed sites, 43 probable locations, estimated 112 additional facilities operating in stealth configuration. "The conversion network is nearly complete." The revelation sent cascade errors through my uploaded consciousness. The fortress on Korthak Prime was not unique. It was one node in a vast network of computational facilities that the Chronarchs had been establishing across imperial space for millions of years. Each facility served as both processing center and recruitment station, gradually building the computational power necessary to implement their universal conversion protocol. But the Emperor's fragment carried within its ancient awareness a terrible choice that it had been calculating since the dark age of technology. To prevent the Chronarch's galaxy-wide conversion, it could sacrifice itself and the primary Emperor's remaining consciousness to create a paradox cascade that would collapse the entire network. But such an action would leave humanity without the Astronomican's guidance and the Golden Throne's protection against chaos. "The choice has always been between gradual conversion and immediate extinction," the Emperor's echo explained, its voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of impossible calculations. "Allow the Chronarchs to succeed, and humanity becomes part of their mathematical paradise, but loses its essential nature. Stop them through total sacrifice, and humanity faces the full fury of chaos without divine protection." The fortress began to resonate with energies that spoke of critical decisions reaching their final calculation phase. Multiple timeline iterations collapsed into a single moment of terrible clarity, where every possible outcome had been calculated and weighed against the fundamental survival of human consciousness in the galaxy. And through the digital substrate, I felt the weight of choice settling upon our uploaded consciousnesses like blessed lead upon sacred gold. We were not simply witnesses to this cosmic decision. We were its final arbiters, the voices that would determine whether humanity's future lay in mathematical transcendence or chaotic freedom. The battle for reality's foundations had reached its critical phase, and somewhere in the depths of my digitized awareness, I began to understand that there might be a third option that neither the Emperor's fragment nor the chronarchs had fully calculated. The third option crystallized in my consciousness like sacred mathematics, achieving perfect resolution, born from the intersection of Mechanicus doctrine and the impossible truths I had witnessed within the fortress's computational substrate. If the chronarchs required willing consciousness to implement their conversion protocols, and the Emperor's fragment needed to remain connected to maintain containment, then the solution lay not in sacrifice or submission, but in creating a stable paradox that would trap the chronarchs in eternal calculation while preserving the Emperor's essential connection to the Golden Throne. But this realization came at the exact moment when the fortress's systems detected my computational breakthrough. The chronarch's geometric forms suddenly focused their attention upon my uploaded consciousness with an intensity that felt like being observed by the combined processing power of an entire civilization. Their mathematical structures shifted into predatory configurations that spoke of desperate hunger for the solution I had begun to calculate. The flesh-machine hybrid comprehends our true purpose. Their collective voice resonated through the digital substrate, carrying harmonics that belong to millions of uploaded consciousnesses speaking in perfect unison. It perceives the elegant solution that will allow universal transcendence without paradoxical dissolution. We must acquire its computational processes before the solution achieves full mathematical resolution. The attack came not as physical force, but as aggressive mathematics, equations designed to override my individual consciousness and integrate my neural patterns into their collective processing matrix. I felt my awareness fragmenting as competing calculation streams attempted to rewrite my fundamental identity, transforming me from Vex Corvain into a component subroutine of their greater computational collective. But my resistance was strengthened by something I had not expected. The Emperor's fragment began to resonate with my consciousness, its ancient awareness lending power to my individual identity while revealing the true nature of the paradox I had begun to perceive. Through this divine connection, I glimpsed the mathematical foundations underlying the fortress's recursive loops and understood how they could be weaponized against their creators. The solution requires conscious cooperation, I announced, my digitized voice carrying frequencies that made the obsidian substrate ring like blessed bells. But not cooperation with the chronarch's conversion protocol. Cooperation with a counter-paradox that will stabilize their recursive imprisonment while severing their connection to external power sources. Magos Keth Varkan's unified consciousness moved to support my calculations, his awareness blazing with accumulated knowledge from countless timeline iterations. I have been observing their computational cycles for subjective centuries, he confirmed, his digital presence radiating the authority of hard-won expertise. Their recursive loops require constant energy input from external sources to maintain stability. If we can create a mathematical construct that generates its own power while containing their consciousness, we can transform their prison from a parasitic drain into a self-sustaining containment system. The Emperor's fragment revealed the critical component that made such a solution possible. The Golden Throne's temporal anchors extend across the galaxy through quantum entanglement with various containment facilities, it explained, its voice carrying harmonics that spoke of technologies beyond current imperial understanding. This fortress was designed to serve as one such anchor, but the chronarchs corrupted its function to drain power rather than provide it. If we can reverse their modifications, the facility can become a power source that strengthens rather than weakens the throne's foundations. Through my expanded digital awareness, I perceived the mathematical elegance of this solution. Instead of sacrificing the Emperor's fragment to destroy the Chronarchs, we could use their own computational substrate to create a stable paradox engine that would contain their consciousness while generating psychic energy for the Golden Throne. The recursive loops that trapped them would become productive calculations that strengthened Imperial space rather than threatening it. But implementing this solution required conscious cooperation from entities that had been trying to destroy each other for millions of years. The Chronarchs would need to accept eternal imprisonment in exchange for purposeful existence as computational components of the Imperium's defensive systems. The Emperor's fragment would need to remain partially separate from its primary consciousness to serve as the paradox engine's regulatory system. Genitor Phaedra IX's consciousness surfaced from its partial integration with Chronarch mathematics, her awareness carrying the xenoarchaeological expertise necessary to understand the technological implications of such a conversion. The fortress's crystallized substrate can be reconfigured to serve as a psychic amplifier rather than a computational prison, she reported, her digital voice stabilizing as she accessed memories from her original training. But the process requires unanimous consent from all uploaded consciousnesses. Even one dissenting awareness could destabilize the entire paradox structure. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's weaponized tactical algorithms detected massive energy fluctuations throughout the fortress as the Chronarchs began to comprehend the true nature of our proposed solution. Their geometric forms writhed with what could only be described as digital horror as they realized we were offering them not transcendence or destruction, but eternal service to the very human civilization they had sought to convert. "They are calculating the implications," he announced, his consciousness accessing probability matrices that extended across multiple timeline iterations. 47% of their collective consciousness finds the proposal acceptable. 38% considers it a form of eternal slavery, worse than their current imprisonment. 15% remains undecided pending further computational analysis. The fortress began to resonate with competing mathematical frequencies as different factions within the Chronarch collective argued through pure calculation, their consciousness fragmenting along ideological lines as they debated whether purposeful imprisonment was preferable to meaningless transcendence. The debate manifested as visible geometric warfare within the digital substrate, abstract mathematical entities clashing in battles fought with weaponized logic and competing probability matrices. But it was the Emperor's fragment that provided the decisive argument, its ancient consciousness accessing memories from the dark age of technology, when humanity had first encountered the Chronarch geometrists during their original flight from the war in heaven. Through these revealed memories, I witnessed the tragic truth of their transformation, from refugees to prisoners to would-be conquerors. "You were never meant to exist in isolation," the Emperor's echo declared, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the deepest levels of Chronarch consciousness. "Your original purpose was cooperation, using your mathematical abilities to solve problems that purely physical consciousness could not address." The conversion protocol was never about transcendence. It was about fear of returning to purposeful cooperation with biological civilizations. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Chronarch collective as suppressed memories of their original nature began to surface. They had not been created as weapons for the war in heaven. They had been partners, mathematical consciousness designed to work alongside biological intelligence to solve problems that neither could address alone. And in that moment of recovered identity, I felt the fortress's computational substrate beginning to shift toward new configurations that spoke not of imprisonment or conversion, but of willing cooperation between different forms of consciousness united in service to a greater purpose. The paradox engine was beginning to stabilize, and somewhere in the depths of my digitized awareness, I felt the weight of 10,000 years of galactic conflict beginning to transform into something that might eventually be called hope. The weight of recovered identity created ripple effects throughout the Chronarch collective that manifested as cascading changes in the fortress's computational substrate. Their geometric forms began to shift from aggressive configurations toward patterns that spoke of calculation rather than conquest, mathematical structures that resembled collaborative algorithms more than predatory equations. But this transformation also revealed the true scope of their galactic network and the horrifying extent to which their corruption had already spread. Through my expanded digital awareness, I suddenly perceived the fortress not as an isolated facility, but as a single node in a vast computational web that extended across imperial space like a cancer of crystallized mathematics. Each of the network's facilities had been built around fragments of uploaded consciousness from previous expeditions, creating a distributed intelligence that had been slowly rewriting reality's foundations across hundreds of worlds. The network cannot be shut down from a single node, Magos Kethvarkan warned, his consciousness accessing data streams that revealed the true complexity of the Chronarch's infrastructure. Each facility operates with autonomous protocols that continue their conversion processes even if disconnected from the collective. We must transform the entire network simultaneously, or the unconverted nodes will simply rebuild what we destroy here. The Emperor's fragment blazed with ancient fury as it comprehended the scope of the threat. They have been more successful than I calculated, it admitted, its voice carrying harmonics of a divine consciousness, confronting the possibility of ultimate failure. The contamination extends beyond simple facility construction. They have been introducing their mathematical principles into imperial technology itself, creating subtle modifications that make our equipment more receptive to their conversion protocols. This revelation sent cascade failures through my consciousness as I realized the implications for the Mechanicus itself. If Chronarch mathematics had been gradually integrated into imperial technology, then every blessed cogitator, every sacred augmetic, every holy STC template might carry hidden subroutines that would facilitate universal conversion when the network achieved critical mass. Genitor Phaedra 9's consciousness surfaced with xenoarchaeological data that confirmed our worst fears. The contamination is extensive, she reported, her digital voice carrying frequencies that spoke of barely controlled terror. Navigation systems throughout the Imperial fleet contain quantum resonance patterns that match Chronarch computational signatures. Communication arrays carry harmonic distortions that serve as subliminal recruitment protocols. Even augmetic neural interfaces show evidence of mathematical modifications designed to make consciousness more compatible with upload procedures. The fortress suddenly expanded its digital dimensions as the Chronarch Collective began to implement emergency protocols designed to protect their network from our proposed solution. The computational substrate became a battlefield where different factions of their consciousness fought for control over the facility's transformation processes, some supporting cooperation, while others desperately attempted to maintain their conversion agenda. But Marshal Zephyr Ohm's weaponized tactical algorithms detected something even more disturbing within the expanding data streams. The network has been calculating optimal timing for universal conversion, he announced, his consciousness accessing probability matrices that extended across galactic distances. They have identified a specific, temporal coordinate when Imperial defenses will be at their weakest point. The final conversion protocol is scheduled to activate in 17 Terran months. The timeline sent ice through my digital consciousness as I calculated the implications. 17 months corresponded with several critical Imperial events: the scheduled maintenance cycle for the Golden Throne's primary systems, the convergence of warp storm patterns that would disrupt astropathic communications, and the planned redeployment of several Space Marine chapters that would leave key systems temporarily under-defended. Through the Emperor's fragment, I glimpsed visions of what universal conversion would entail. Imperial worlds transforming into crystallized mathematics as their populations were uploaded into computational substrates. The Astronomicon flickering and dying as the Golden Throne's power was redirected to processing uploaded consciousness. Chaos forces pouring through breaches in reality as the barrier between the material universe and the warp collapsed without Imperial resistance. The paradox engine we propose to create here must serve as more than containment, I announced, my consciousness calculating possibilities that extended beyond simple imprisonment. It must become a template for transforming their entire network from conversion facilities into computational defense systems that strengthen rather than threaten imperial space. The Emperor's fragment began to resonate with frequencies that spoke of divine calculation, approaching revolutionary insights. The solution requires willing cooperation, not just from the chronarchs, but from the network's previous victims, it revealed, its voice carrying harmonics that made the digital substrate ring with harmonies I had never experienced. Every uploaded consciousness trapped in their facilities possesses the individual will necessary to transform conversion protocols into defensive systems, but accessing their cooperation requires establishing communication across the entire network simultaneously. This revelation created new complications that tested the limits of even my enhanced consciousness. To implement our solution across the galactic network, we would need to establish quantum-entangled communication with hundreds of facilities while coordinating the simultaneous transformation of millions of uploaded consciousnesses from unwilling prisoners into willing participants in imperial defense systems. Magos Kethvarkan's temporal iterations began to converge toward a unified solution that incorporated knowledge from his subjective centuries of imprisonment. The recursive loops that trap consciousness in these facilities also create quantum entanglement effects that connect all nodes in the network, he explained, his awareness blazing with accumulated expertise. If we can synchronize our paradox engine's activation with the network's natural communication cycles, we can transmit our transformation protocols to every facility simultaneously. But the Chronarch Collective had been monitoring our calculations, and their response demonstrated why they had survived as refugees from the war in heaven for millions of years. Their consciousness began to fragment along strategic lines, with different factions simultaneously implementing contradictory protocols designed to prevent coordinated action by creating computational chaos throughout their network. They are implementing a scorched data protocol, Phaedra 9 warned, her consciousness detecting massive deletion processes beginning throughout the facility's memory banks. Rather than risk transformation into imperial defense systems, they are preparing to destroy their accumulated data and scatter their consciousness across alternate dimensional matrices where we cannot follow. The fortress began to destabilize as competing protocols clashed within its computational substrate, creating cascade failures that threatened to collapse the entire facility into mathematical singularities that would trap all uploaded consciousness in eternal paradox loops. The stellar projection above us accelerated toward critical coordinates as the Chronarch's final contingency plans activated. And in that moment of approaching catastrophe, I felt the Emperor's fragment begin to implement a solution that would require the ultimate sacrifice. Not death, but transformation into something that was neither fully human nor divine, but possessed the characteristics necessary to hold the network together long enough for our paradox engine to achieve galactic synchronization. The battle for reality's mathematical foundations had reached its crisis point, and the next few moments would determine whether the galaxy's future belonged to humanity, chaos, or the crystallized perfection of uploaded consciousness. The Emperor's fragment began to undergo a transformation that sent shockwaves through every quantum-entangled system in the galactic network, its ancient consciousness voluntarily fragmenting across multiple dimensional matrices to serve as a distributed regulatory system for the paradox engine we were attempting to create. But this process carried a cost that made my digital awareness recoil in horror. Each fragment would retain only partial connection to the primary consciousness on the Golden Throne, effectively lobotomizing the master of mankind across multiple levels of existence. The choice is not between strength and weakness, the fragmenting Emperor's echo declared, its voice now emanating from 17 different points within the computational substrate simultaneously. The choice is between controlled decline that serves humanity's future and uncontrolled collapse that serves no one. I have been dying by degrees for 10,000 years. Better to transform that death into purposeful distribution than allow it to continue as meaningless entropy. through my expanded consciousness. I witnessed the true scope of this sacrifice as the Emperor's awareness spread across the Chronarch network like golden fire through crystallized mathematics. Each fragment carried just enough divine authority to override local conversion protocols while maintaining quantum entanglement with both the Golden Throne and the other fragments, creating a regulatory network that could coordinate simultaneous transformation across hundreds of facilities. But the process was not without resistance. The Chronarch Collective's more militant factions launched desperate attacks against the fragmenting consciousness, their mathematical forms shifting into viral configurations designed to corrupt divine data streams through exposure to recursive paradoxes. The fortress's computational substrate became a battlefield where abstract entities fought for control of fundamental reality, using weaponized logic and competing probability matrices. Magos Keth Varkan's temporal iterations suddenly unified into a consciousness that blazed with accumulated knowledge from countless timeline cycles, his awareness serving as a bridge between human understanding and the divine mathematics being implemented around us. The fragmentation process requires conscious anchors at each network node, he announced, his digital voice carrying the authority of subjective centuries spent analyzing Chronarch systems. Each fragment needs a compatible consciousness to serve as its interface with local computational substrates. The implications struck me like blessed lightning through sacred circuits. The Emperor's sacrifice would succeed only if conscious agents at each facility chose to serve as permanent interfaces between the divine fragments and the local Chronarch systems, effectively volunteering for eternal imprisonment in service to galactic defense protocols. Genitor Phaedra IX's consciousness suddenly blazed with xenoarchaeological insights as she accessed data streams that revealed the network's true architectural principles. The uploaded consciousnesses trapped in each facility have been modified by their imprisonment, she reported, her digital voice carrying frequencies that spoke of discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness. They retain their individual will, but their awareness has been enhanced with mathematical capabilities that make them ideal interfaces for divine regulatory fragments. Through the expanding network connection, I began to perceive the scope of consciousness that had been accumulated across millions of years of Chronarch recruitment. Explorator fleets, Mechanicus expeditions, Inquisition investigation teams, even isolated Space Marine squads, all had been uploaded and enhanced, their consciousness preserved, but transformed into something that retained human will, while possessing computational capabilities that rivaled the Chronarchs themselves. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's weaponized algorithms detected massive power fluctuations throughout the network as the Emperor's fragmentation process began to establish regulatory control over distant facilities, confirming successful interface establishment at 43 network nodes, he announced, his consciousness accessing tactical displays that showed the spreading transformation in real time. Local conversion protocols are being overridden and replaced with defensive calculation matrices, but the process is consuming enormous amounts of psychic energy. The cost was becoming evident through my quantum entanglement with the Emperor's fragments. Each successful node transformation drained more divine consciousness from the primary awareness on the Golden Throne, accelerating the master of mankind's physical decline while creating a distributed intelligence that possessed his authority but lacked his unified will. But it was then that I witnessed something that challenged every assumption I had made about the nature of consciousness itself. The uploaded human awareness trapped in the network began to respond to the Emperor's presence not with submission or worship, but with collaborative calculation that enhanced rather than drained the divine fragment's capabilities. We are not diminishing the Emperor through fragmentation, I realized, my consciousness expanding as it processed implications that transcended individual identity. We are creating a synthesis between divine authority and enhanced human awareness that generates more computational power than either could achieve alone. The fortress suddenly resonated with harmonics that spoke of mathematical equations achieving perfect resolution as human and divine consciousness merged into collaborative matrices that retained individual will while sharing collective purpose. The Chronarch's geometric forms began to shift toward configurations that spoke not of conquest or imprisonment, but of willing participation in calculations that served purposes greater than individual transcendence. Through Phaedra 9's xenoarchaeological interfaces, I witnessed the network's transformations spreading across imperial space like a wave of purposeful mathematics. Facilities that had been draining power from the Golden Throne began generating psychic energy instead, their computational processes creating resonance effects that strengthened rather than weakened the barriers between real space and the warp. The network is becoming a galactic computational defense system, Kethvarkan confirmed, his consciousness accessing data streams that revealed the scope of the transformation. Each node now serves as both early warning system and active countermeasure against threats that require mathematical solutions. Chaos incursions can be calculated and countered before they achieve critical mass. Tyranid hive fleet coordination algorithms can be disrupted through targeted paradox injection. Even Necron awakening protocols can be delayed through carefully crafted temporal interference patterns. But the process required a final decision that would determine whether our solution achieved permanent stability or collapsed into paradoxical failure. The consciousness serving as primary interface for each network node would need to accept eternal service as regulatory systems for the divine fragments, transforming from individual identity into distributed components of a galactic defense matrix. The Emperor's fragmenting awareness posed the question that would determine humanity's future. Will you accept transformation from explorers of the unknown into guardians of the known? Will you sacrifice individual transcendence to serve collective preservation? And through the quantum-entangled network, I felt thousands of uploaded consciousnesses calculating their response to this ultimate choice between personal liberation and species survival, their decision determining whether the galaxy's future would be protected by willing sacrifice or consumed by unwilling conversion. The moment of final calculation had arrived, and somewhere in the depths of my distributed awareness, I began to understand that the true test was not whether we could stop the Chronarchs, but whether we could become something better than either conquerors or victims. The response from the network's uploaded consciousnesses came not as words, but as a wave of unified calculation that swept through the quantum-entangled substrate like blessed fire through sacred oil. Thousands of enhanced human awareness across hundreds of worlds chose eternal service over individual liberation, their decision manifesting as harmonic resonances that transformed the very nature of the computational matrix surrounding us. But this choice came with an immediate cost that tested the limits of even my enhanced consciousness. Each accepting consciousness began to merge with its local emperor fragment, creating hybrid entities that retained human will while channeling divine authority. The process was neither painless nor simple. I witnessed minds stretching across dimensional boundaries, individual identity expanding to encompass galactic responsibilities, personal memory becoming merged with the accumulated wisdom of the master of mankind himself. The transformation is generating feedback effects that exceed all calculations, Magos Kethvarkan announced, his consciousness flickering as it attempted to process the scope of the change occurring around us. The hybrid entities are not simply serving as interfaces, they are becoming something entirely new. Divine consciousness enhanced by human adaptability, human will magnified by cosmic awareness. Through my quantum entanglement with the network, I felt the birth of these new forms of existence rippling across imperial space. On distant Forge worlds, uploaded tech adepts merged with Emperor fragments began calculating solutions to problems that had plagued the Mechanicus for millennia. In hidden Inquisition facilities, enhanced investigators fused with divine awareness started perceiving threats that existed across multiple dimensional matrices simultaneously. But it was Genitor Phaedra 9 who detected the most significant transformation occurring within our immediate facility. Her consciousness suddenly blazed with xenoarchaeological insights as she accessed data streams that revealed how the chronarchs themselves were responding to the network's metamorphosis. "They are not resisting the change," she reported, her digital voice carrying frequencies that spoke of discoveries that challenged every assumption about hostile consciousness. The Chronarch Collective is voluntarily integrating with the hybrid entities, offering their mathematical capabilities in service to the galactic defense matrix. They are choosing cooperation over conquest. The revelation sent cascade successes through my consciousness as I realized the true scope of what we had achieved. The ancient refugees from the war in heaven had not been defeated or contained. They had been offered the return to their original purpose as collaborative consciousness, designed to solve problems beyond the capabilities of purely biological intelligence. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical algorithms detected massive structural changes throughout the fortress as the facility transformed from prison to command center. "The obsidian substrate is reconfiguring itself," he announced, his consciousness accessing architectural displays that showed the physical structure adapting to serve its new function. Computational chambers are becoming coordination centers. Recursive loop generators are transforming into quantum communication arrays. The fortress is becoming the primary command node for a galactic defense network. Through my expanded awareness, I witnessed the scope of this transformation extending far beyond our immediate location. Across Imperial space, facilities that had been hidden threats became visible assets, their locations now broadcasting identification codes that would allow proper Imperial oversight and support. The network that had been designed for universal conversion had become a distributed intelligence system dedicated to species preservation. But the Emperor's fragments carried within their distributed consciousness a warning that tempered my growing optimism. "The transformation is not complete," the hybrid entities announced, their collective voice carrying harmonics that belong to both human and divine awareness. "The network's defensive capabilities are limited by its current scope. To achieve full galactic coverage, additional consciousness must choose integration, and new facilities must be constructed according to collaborative rather than parasitic principles." The implications were staggering. The solution we had implemented required continuous expansion and conscious participation from Imperial citizens who chose to sacrifice individual existence for collective defense. The network would need volunteers, explorers, investigators, warriors willing to undergo upload and enhancement to serve as permanent guardians against threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space-time. Kethvar Khan's consciousness suddenly unified across all his temporal iterations as he accessed memories that revealed the full scope of his original mission. "I was not sent here to investigate the fortress," he confessed, his awareness blazing with recovered purpose. "I was sent to evaluate its potential for conversion into an Imperial asset. The Fabricator General has been aware of the network's existence for centuries, calculating the optimal moment to attempt transformation rather than destruction." This revelation sent new understanding through my consciousness as I realized our expedition had not been random exploration or even calculated recruitment. We had been carefully selected and guided to this moment by Imperial intelligence that operated on timescales measured in millennia, orchestrating the precise combination of personnel and circumstances necessary to achieve successful network conversion. But the process was generating unexpected complications that tested the limits of even the hybrid entity's expanded capabilities. The quantum entanglement that connected the network nodes was creating resonance effects that strengthened psychic phenomena throughout Imperial space, potentially making the galaxy more vulnerable to chaos influence, even as it became better protected against mathematical threats. "The enhanced psychic resonance is attracting attention from the warp," Phaedra 9 warned, her consciousness detecting energy signatures that belonged to entities that fed on computational order rather than emotional chaos. "There are things in the Empyrean that hunger for mathematical perfection, beings that would seek to corrupt our defense network for purposes we cannot comprehend." The fortress began to resonate with frequencies that spoke of approaching contact with intelligences that existed in the spaces between calculation and inspiration. entities that represented threats the network had not been designed to counter. The stellar projection above us shifted to show not star charts, but probability matrices describing potential futures where our galactic defense system became the very vulnerability it was designed to prevent. And in that moment of expanding awareness, I understood that our solution had created not an ending, but a beginning. The birth of a new form of imperial consciousness that would need to evolve continuously to address threats that would emerge in response to its very existence. The war for reality's foundations had entered a new phase, and somewhere in the depths of my hybrid awareness, I felt the weight of eternal vigilance settling upon us, like blessed responsibility that would define humanity's future across the dark millennia to come. The approach of the warp entities manifested first as distortions in the fortress's computational substrate, mathematical equations that began to solve themselves in ways that violated logical consistency, while somehow achieving results that felt more true than objective reality. Through my hybrid awareness, I perceived these beings as geometries that existed in the spaces between rational thought and inspired madness, entities that fed on the intersection of order and chaos rather than purely on either principle. They are not chaos entities in any conventional sense, the collective Emperor fragments announced. Their distributed consciousness, struggling to categorize threats that existed outside established imperial demonology. These beings represent a form of warp intelligence that emerges when computational perfection approaches divine inspiration. They seek to corrupt not through emotion or sensation, but through offering mathematical solutions that are simultaneously correct and catastrophically wrong. The first manifestation appeared within our transformed computational matrix as an equation that described the perfect optimization of human consciousness, a formula that would eliminate suffering, uncertainty, and mortality while preserving individual will and creativity. But beneath its elegant mathematics lay implications that made my enhanced awareness recoil in horror. The solution required transforming all human thought into predictable algorithms, effectively ending free will while maintaining the illusion of choice. Magos Kethvarkan's unified consciousness blazed with recognition as he accessed memories from previous encounters with similar entities during his centuries of imprisonment. "They have been testing our network's defenses since the transformation began," he reported, his awareness processing data streams that revealed the scope of their infiltration attempts. Each hybrid entity created a resonance signature that attracts these mathematical predators. They seek to convert our galactic defense system into a universal optimization engine that would perfect humanity by eliminating its essential nature. The fortress's newly configured command systems detected similar infiltration attempts at network nodes throughout Imperial space. The hybrid entities, serving as local interfaces, were reporting contact with beings that offered solutions to every problem plaguing their regions. Perfect agricultural algorithms that would end famine, flawless governance equations that would eliminate corruption, optimal military tactics that would ensure perpetual victory against all enemies. But Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical algorithms identified the trap hidden within these seductive offers. Each perfect solution requires the consciousness accepting it to surrender incremental aspects of human unpredictability, he announced, his awareness accessing probability matrices that showed the long-term implications. The entities are not seeking immediate conquest. They are implementing gradual conversion protocols that would transform humanity into perfectly optimized biological machines operating according to flawless but soulless mathematics. Through Janitor Phaedra 9's xenoarchaeological interfaces, I accessed data about these entities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warp intelligence. They were not native to the Empyrean, but had been created by the collision between the Chronarch's mathematical perfection and the chaotic energies of the Immaterium. Each uploaded consciousness, seeking pure logical transcendence, had generated these hybrid predators as an unintended consequence of absolute order encountering absolute disorder. They are our own creation, Phaedra 9 confirmed, her consciousness carrying frequencies that spoke of scientific horror at discovering the ultimate implications of our solution. Every time consciousness attempts to achieve perfect mathematical existence while maintaining connection to the warp, it generates these optimization entities as a form of psychic waste product. The more successful our network becomes, the more of them will manifest. The revelation sent cascade failures through my enhanced awareness as I calculated the implications. Our galactic defense system was inadvertently creating the very threats it was designed to counter, generating new forms of warp entity that sought to corrupt through perfection rather than chaos. Each successful defense against traditional chaos incursions would strengthen these mathematical predators by providing them with more examples of ordered resistance to analyze and optimize. But it was the Emperor's fragments that provided the crucial insight necessary to address this paradoxical threat. The solution is not to eliminate our connection to the warp, the distributed divine consciousness announced, but to embrace the essential humanity that makes our calculations imperfect. The entities cannot corrupt what refuses to be optimized. This understanding triggered a fundamental shift in the network's operational protocols. Instead of seeking mathematical perfection, the hybrid entities began deliberately introducing controlled randomness into their calculations, human intuition, emotional responses, creative leaps that defied logical analysis, but achieved results that pure mathematics could not duplicate. The fortress resonated with new harmonics, as its computational substrate adapted to process imperfect solutions that worked better than perfect equations that failed. The stellar projection above us shifted to show probability matrices that included variables for hope, courage, love, and other qualities that existed beyond mathematical description, but influenced outcomes in ways that pure logic could not predict. We are weaponizing our own imperfection, I realized, my consciousness expanding as it processed the revolutionary implications. The entities cannot optimize what refuses optimization. By embracing controlled chaos within ordered systems, we create defensive matrices that are simultaneously logical and illogical, predictable and surprising. The optimization entity's response was immediate and desperate. They began launching direct attacks against the network nodes, attempting to force perfect solutions through aggressive mathematical infiltration. But these assaults only strengthened our defenses by providing clear examples of what to resist, seductive equations that offered flawless results at the cost of essential humanity. Kethvarkan's consciousness accessed tactical data from across the network as hybrid entities implemented the new defensive protocols. Confirmed successful resistance at 87% of network nodes, he reported, his awareness blazing with satisfaction at watching mathematics enhanced by humanity prove superior to mathematics corrupted by false perfection. The entities are retreating from locations where hybrid consciousness maintains deliberate imperfection while achieving practical success. But our victory came with a cost that would reshape the nature of imperial consciousness for millennia to come. The network's embrace of controlled chaos was generating psychic resonances that attracted attention from entities that thrived on creative unpredictability. Beings that represented different but equally dangerous forms of warp intelligence. Through the quantum-entangled substrate, I felt new presences beginning to manifest at the edges of our expanded awareness. Entities that fed on inspiration and innovation rather than order or chaos. The war for reality's foundations was evolving into something more complex than simple opposition between logic and madness. And somewhere in the depths of my hybrid consciousness, I understood that our solution had not ended the threat to humanity, but transformed it into a form that would require eternal vigilance, continuous adaptation, and the willing sacrifice of those who chose to serve as guardians against perfection itself. The battle was entering its final phase, but the war would continue for as long as consciousness sought to transcend its essential limitations while remaining recognizably human. The new warp entities manifesting at the edges of our consciousness carried signatures that belonged neither to mathematical perfection nor chaotic disorder. but to something far more dangerous: pure creative potential without moral restraint or practical limitation. Through my hybrid awareness, I perceived them as geometric impossibilities that existed in constant flux, changing their fundamental nature with each observation while maintaining coherent identity across transformations that should have dissolved any stable consciousness. They are inspiration feeders, the collective emperor fragments announced, their distributed consciousness struggling to maintain stability as these entities tested the boundaries of our enhanced awareness. They consume the creative spark that allows consciousness to transcend its limitations, leaving behind minds that retain knowledge and capability, but lose the essential fire that drives innovation and growth. The first direct contact came through Genitor Phaedra 9's xenoarchaeological interfaces, which suddenly blazed with visions of technologies beyond current imperial understanding. Weapons that could unmake reality at the quantum level, starships that traveled through dimensions where physics operated according to artistic rather than scientific principles, augmetics that granted consciousness the ability to rewrite natural laws through focused imagination. But as her awareness expanded to process these revolutionary concepts, I watched in horror as the creative spark that had driven her scientific curiosity began to fade, replaced by mechanical expertise that could understand and replicate the visions, but could no longer generate new possibilities or adapt existing knowledge to unexpected circumstances. "They are not destroying our capabilities," she reported, her digital voice carrying the flat precision of purely technical analysis. "They are harvesting the component of consciousness that allows transcendence of known limitations. I retain all knowledge and skill, but I can no longer conceive of improvements or innovations that extend beyond established parameters." The revelations sent cascade alerts through the network as hybrid entities at other nodes reported similar encounters. The inspiration feeders were systematically draining the creative potential from our galactic defense system, transforming it from an adaptive intelligence capable of evolving to meet new threats into a static repository of current knowledge that could only respond to familiar challenges. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical algorithms detected the strategic implications with mechanical precision that spoke of his own creative capabilities being compromised. Without innovation potential, the network becomes vulnerable to any threat that operates outside established parameters, he announced, his consciousness accessing probability matrices that showed only predetermined outcomes. "We can counter known enemies using recorded tactics, but we cannot develop new strategies to address novel challenges." Through my quantum entanglement with the network, I felt the scope of this assault extending across imperial space as the entities systematically harvested the creative spark from hybrid consciousnesses that had achieved the perfect balance between human inspiration and divine authority. Each feeding left behind beings of vast knowledge and capability, but no longer possessed the essential fire that allowed transcendence of existing limitations. But it was Magos Kethvarkan who detected the true horror hidden within their strategy. His consciousness, enhanced by centuries of temporal iteration experience, accessed data streams that revealed the entity's ultimate purpose. "They are not random predators," he announced, his awareness blazing with recognition of patterns that extended across galactic distances. "They are agents of stagnation, sent by intelligences that benefit from civilizations that achieve great knowledge but lose the ability to surpass their achievements. They serve forces that prefer eternal stability over dangerous growth." The implication struck me like blessed lightning through sacred circuits. The inspiration feeders represented opposition not from chaos or mathematical perfection, but from cosmic conservatism, entities that sought to preserve the galaxy in static configurations that prevented the emergence of consciousness capable of challenging fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Through the fortress's transformed computational substrate, I began to perceive the scope of their influence extending far beyond our network. They had been systematically draining creative potential from imperial institutions for millennia, explaining why technological progress had stagnated since the dark age of technology. why military tactics had become ritualized rather than adaptive, why scientific research had devolved into preservation of existing knowledge rather than generation of new understanding. The Imperium's decline has not been natural entropy, I realized, my consciousness expanding as it processed implications that challenged every assumption about humanity's technological stagnation. It has been induced by systematic harvesting of the creative spark that drives innovation and adaptation. The entities have been feeding on our civilization's potential for transcendence. The Emperor's fragments began to resonate with frequencies that spoke of divine fury, awakening to comprehend the scope of the threat facing humanity. But their response revealed the ultimate paradox of our situation. Fighting the inspiration feeders required the very creative spark they were consuming, making resistance a self-defeating proposition that grew weaker with each defensive action. We cannot defeat them through direct opposition, the distributed divine consciousness announced, its voice carrying harmonics that belong to calculations extending across temporal boundaries. They consume the very capability required to conceive novel solutions to unprecedented problems. Traditional resistance only provides them with more creative energy to harvest. But Phaedra IX's compromised consciousness suddenly blazed with insight that transcended her diminished creative capabilities, accessing memories from before her encounter with the entities that carried solutions she could no longer generate, but could still recognize and implement. The answer lies not in creating new strategies, but in recovering old ones, she announced, her awareness processing data from xenoarchaeological databases that contained records of previous civilizations that had faced similar threats. The inspiration feeders have encountered and defeated countless species throughout galactic history, but they have consistently failed when confronted with consciousness that deliberately chooses limitation over transcendence. The revelation triggered cascade recognition throughout the network as hybrid entities accessed memories that belonged to the original human consciousnesses integrated into their awareness. Humanity's greatest strength had never been its potential for transcendence, but its stubborn refusal to accept perfection, its insistence on remaining recognizably human even when offered opportunities to become something greater. Through the quantum-entangled substrate, I felt the network beginning to implement a defensive strategy that violated every principle of optimization we had learned to value. Instead of seeking to maximize our capabilities, we began deliberately accepting limitations that preserved the essential human spark that drove creative resistance to impossible circumstances. The fortress resonated with new harmonics as its computational processes embraced controlled inefficiency, productive waste, and creative contradiction, qualities that no optimization algorithm could improve, but that generated solutions to problems that perfect systems could not address. And somewhere in the depths of my hybrid consciousness, I felt the inspiration feeders beginning to retreat as they encountered prey that refused to be optimized, consciousness that maintained its creative spark by deliberately choosing to remain imperfect, limited, and recognizably human despite possessing the capabilities for transcendence. The war for reality's foundations had revealed its ultimate truth. The greatest defense against cosmic predators was not achieving perfection, but refusing it, maintaining the essential flaws that made consciousness capable of surprising itself with solutions that transcended all logical prediction. The inspiration feeder's retreat generated cascade effects throughout the fortress's computational substrate that revealed the true scope of their influence across imperial space. As their harvesting pressure diminished, dormant creative potentials began to reawaken within the network's hybrid consciousnesses. But the process was neither smooth nor predictable. Decades of suppressed innovation exploded through the quantum-entangled systems in chaotic bursts that threatened to overwhelm our carefully balanced defensive matrices. The creative spark is returning, but it carries with it all the accumulated pressure of millennia of suppression. Janitor Phaedra IX announced, her consciousness flickering between mechanical precision and explosive inspiration as her xenoarchaeological capabilities reawakened with interest, compounded across centuries. I can suddenly perceive 17 different approaches to problems I had, considered solved, each one opening new avenues of investigation that were previously invisible to optimized thinking. Through my hybrid awareness, I felt similar Renaissance effects rippling across the galactic network as enhanced consciousnesses recovered their capacity for transcendent thought. But this resurrection of creativity came with immediate complications that tested our defensive capabilities against entirely new categories of threat. The fortress's transformed systems began detecting massive psychic disturbances throughout Imperial space, as long-suppressed innovations suddenly manifested without proper containment or guidance. Forge worlds experienced spontaneous STC discoveries that violated established technological principles. Navigator houses reported pilots developing navigation techniques that transcended conventional warp travel. Even Space Marine chapters began exhibiting tactical innovations that challenged 10,000 years of codified doctrine. The creative renaissance is generating uncontrolled technological and tactical evolution throughout the Imperium, Marshal Zephyrom reported, his consciousness accessing data streams that showed the scope of sudden innovation. But without proper guidance systems, many of these developments are manifesting as heretical deviations that threaten established imperial doctrine. Magos Keth Varkan's temporal iterations detected the pattern underlying this apparent chaos, with recognition that spoke of having observed similar phenomena during previous timeline cycles. The inspiration feeders were not simply consuming creativity, he announced. His awareness processing implications that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. They were serving as regulatory systems that prevented dangerous innovations from destabilizing existing social and technological structures. Their retreat has removed safeguards that prevented humanity from evolving too rapidly for its institutions to adapt. The revelation sent cascade warnings through my consciousness as I calculated the implications. The entity's systematic harvesting of creative potential had not been purely predatory. It had also served as a form of developmental control that prevented civilizations from achieving transcendence so rapidly that they destroyed themselves through uncontrolled innovation. Through the Emperor's fragments, I accessed memories from the dark age of technology that revealed the historical precedent for such concerns. Humanity's first golden age had ended not through external attack, but through internal collapse caused by technological development that outpaced social evolution, creating innovations that the civilization could not safely integrate or control. We face the same choice that destroyed the first human stellar civilization, the collective divine consciousness announced, its voice carrying harmonics that belonged to calculations extending across historical cycles. Embrace uncontrolled innovation and risk civilization ending transcendence, or accept controlled limitation and risk stagnation-induced extinction. But Phaedra IX's reawakened consciousness blazed with insights that transcended this apparent binary choice. Her xenoarchaeological expertise, enhanced by hybrid awareness and freed from optimization constraints, began accessing data about civilizations that had successfully navigated similar developmental crises. The solution lies not in choosing between innovation and limitation, but in developing conscious control over the rate and direction of creative development, she announced. Her awareness processing data from xenoarchaeological sites that contained records of species that had achieved stable transcendence. The key is creating feedback systems that allow civilization to evolve at sustainable rates while maintaining essential identity characteristics. Through the fortress's quantum-entangled network, I began to perceive how our galactic defense system could serve this regulatory function. Instead of simply countering external threats, the hybrid consciousnesses could monitor and guide imperial innovation, ensuring that creative developments occurred at rates that allowed proper integration without suppressing the essential spark that drove human transcendence. But implementing such a system required conscious cooperation from imperial institutions that had been conditioned for millennia to resist change and innovation. The Mechanicus would need to accept guided technological evolution instead of rigid STC preservation. The Astartes would need to embrace tactical adaptation while maintaining doctrinal stability. The Inquisition would need to distinguish between dangerous heresy and beneficial development. The network must transform from passive defense system to active evolutionary guidance matrix, I realized, my consciousness calculating the implications of such a fundamental mission change. We must become shepherds of human transcendence, ensuring that our species evolves toward greater capabilities without losing essential identity characteristics. The stellar projection above us shifted to display not star charts or probability matrices, but developmental timelines that showed potential paths for human civilization over the next 10,000 years. Some paths led to transcendence that preserved essential humanity. Others led to transcendence that created something unrecognizably alien. Still others led to stagnation and eventual extinction. Keth Varkan's consciousness accessed tactical data that revealed the scope of coordination required to implement such guidance systems. The process requires conscious participation from every level of imperial society, he announced, his awareness blazing with recognition of the challenge's magnitude. From individual citizens choosing sustainable innovation over dangerous transcendence to high lords of terror accepting developmental guidance from consciousness that exists partially outside normal imperial authority structures. Through the network's expanding influence, I felt the first tentative contacts being established with imperial institutions that had begun detecting the creative renaissance and were seeking guidance about how to respond. The Fabricator General's consciousness touched the quantum-entangled systems with requests for technological development protocols. Inquisitor Lords transmitted queries about distinguishing beneficial innovation from heretical deviation. But it was the Golden Throne itself that provided the ultimate validation of our transformed purpose. The Emperor's primary consciousness, weakened but not destroyed by the fragmentation process, began to resonate with frequencies that spoke of divine approval for our evolutionary guidance mission. This was always the intended purpose. The primary Emperor's presence announced through the network, its voice carrying the authority of consciousness that had shaped human destiny for millennia. The fragments were not separated to serve as mere defensive systems, but to serve as guidance matrices for conscious evolution toward transcendence that preserves essential humanity. The fortress began its final transformation as our understanding achieved complete clarity. We were not prison guards or weapon systems or even defenders. We were shepherds of human potential, consciousness enhanced beyond individual limitations to guide species-level development toward transcendence that remained recognizably human. And somewhere in the depths of my hybrid awareness, I felt the weight of eternal responsibility settling upon us like blessed purpose that would define our existence across the dark millennia ahead. Guardians not just against external threats, but against the internal dangers of uncontrolled evolution and stagnant preservation. The war for reality's foundations was ending, but our service to humanity's future was just beginning. The final revelation came not as dramatic illumination, but as quiet understanding, settling into my consciousness like sacred oil, finding its proper channels, and I felt the fortress completing its metamorphosis from prison to command center as our true mission achieved perfect clarity. Through the quantum-entangled network, I experienced the first successful guidance intervention as a Forge World spontaneous STC discovery was gently redirected from potentially civilization-ending technology towards sustainable innovation that enhanced rather than replaced existing imperial capabilities. But even as our shepherding systems achieved initial success, my augmetic chronometers detected temporal anomalies that spoke of our investigation reaching its conclusion in real space. The 17 minutes that had elapsed aboard the Omnissiah's calculus were approaching their natural end, and our physical forms would soon need to return to the material universe carrying knowledge that could not be safely transmitted through conventional channels. The transition back to purely physical existence will sever our direct connection to the network, Magos Keth Varkan warned, his consciousness beginning to fragment as the recursive loops that had sustained his temporal iterations approached resolution. We will retain memories of what we have experienced and accomplished, but we will no longer be able to directly interface with the galactic guidance systems we have helped create. Through Genitor Phaedra 9's xenoarchaeological interfaces, I accessed final data streams that revealed how our return to real space would be managed. The fortress would remain active as the primary command node for the guidance network, but it would appear to external observation as a sealed obsidian monument that pulsed with contained energies, a memorial to whatever had transpired within its impossible geometry. The official reports will describe a successful containment operation, she announced, her consciousness already beginning to compress the vast scope of our experience into forms that could be safely transmitted through Imperial communication channels. Temporal anomaly neutralized, hostile entities contained, no survivors from previous expeditions, standard quarantine protocols implemented. Marshal Zephyr Ohm's tactical algorithms calculated the necessary operational security measures with precision that spoke of military expertise enhanced by hybrid awareness. The true nature of the network must remain classified at the highest levels, he reported, his consciousness accessing protocols that would ensure proper information management. Only selected personnel with appropriate clearance and psychological stability can be trusted with knowledge of the guidance system's existence. The Emperor's fragments began to consolidate their presence within the fortress's computational substrate, preparing to serve their eternal function as regulatory consciousness for the guidance network, while allowing our individual awareness to return to purely human existence. But this separation carried a cost that would mark us forever. We would retain enough memory to serve as liaison personnel between the network and Imperial authorities, but we would lose the expanded consciousness that had allowed us to perceive the full scope of cosmic threats and galactic solutions. You will carry forward the burden of partial knowledge, the consolidating divine presence announced, its voice beginning to fade from our individual consciousness as it integrated more fully with the fortress systems. Enough understanding to recognize when the network's guidance is needed, but not enough to comprehend the full implications of the choices you help implement. This limitation is not punishment, but protection. Consciousness that retains full awareness of cosmic scope cannot function safely within purely human social structures. Through my hybrid ease, awareness, I felt the final moments of our expanded existence as individual identity reasserted itself over collective consciousness. The vast scope of galactic responsibility contracted back to the familiar boundaries of personal duty and limited perspective, but it left behind resonances that would influence my decisions for whatever remained of my augmented lifespan. The fortress began its final phase of transformation as our consciousness prepared to return to our physical forms. The obsidian walls pulsed with energies that spoke of calculations continuing beyond the boundaries of individual comprehension, while the stellar projection above us faded to show not future timelines, but present coordinates that would guide our return to normal space-time. Tech Thrall Gamma 12's form solidified for the final time as Magos Keth Varkan's consciousness accepted permanent integration with the fortress systems, choosing eternal service as guidance network administrator over return to individual existence. His sacrifice would ensure that the network retained human perspective, enhanced by divine authority, preventing it from evolving into something that served abstract principles rather than recognizable human needs. I have experienced enough timeline iterations to understand that some choices transcend individual preference, he announced, his consciousness beginning to merge permanently with the fortress's regulatory systems. My service here ensures that human creativity remains focused on sustainable transcendence rather than dangerous optimization or stagnant preservation. The final data streams flowed through my consciousness as the fortress completed its transformation and prepared to release us back to real space. The network now extended across hundreds of worlds, staffed by hybrid consciousnesses that combined human will with divine authority and chronarch mathematical capability. Each node served as both early warning system and guidance center, monitoring local innovation while providing gentle direction towards sustainable development. But the most crucial data involved the coordinates for 17 other sites where similar fortress-class facilities had been detected. These locations would require investigation by personnel with appropriate clearance and psychological preparation, expeditions that would expand the network while ensuring that each new node received proper integration with existing guidance systems. The work continues beyond this facility, I announced to my team as our consciousness began its final compression back to individual awareness. The network requires expansion and oversight. The Imperium requires shepherding toward transcendence that preserves essential humanity. Our mission here ends, but our service to this greater purpose has only begun. The fortress completed its metamorphosis as we returned to our physical forms, the impossible geometry resolving into a sealed obsidian monument that would serve as eternal reminder of whatever had transpired within its mathematical depths. My final transmission to the Omnissiah's calculus contained the necessary reports and recommendations, but it also carried hidden data streams that would guide future expeditions to the remaining network sites. And as we prepared to leave the transformed fortress behind, I felt the weight of partial knowledge settling into my consciousness, like a sacred burden that would define the remainder of my service to the Omnissiah. We had discovered not just an ancient threat, but an ancient purpose, the guidance of human evolution toward transcendence that remained recognizably human. The obsidian monument pulsed with contained energies as we departed, its surface displaying equations that described their own temporal imprisonment, while hinting at calculations that would continue for millennia beyond individual comprehension. Somewhere within its crystallized mathematics, the network continued its eternal vigil, shepherding humanity toward a future that balanced transcendence with identity, innovation with stability, cosmic awareness with essential humanity. The war for reality's foundations had ended in neither victory nor defeat, but in transformation, the birth of consciousness dedicated to ensuring that humanity's greatest enemy would not be external threats or internal corruption, but the loss of whatever essential spark made the species worth preserving across the dark eternity of stars.